You don't hire a human because they are civilized. You hire them because they know exactly when to stop being civilized. Gideon spent 5 years standing quietly behind the royal family, a blunt instrument in a tailored suit. When the coup hit, the nobles thought they had won. They killed the king, slapped collar irons on Princess Victoria, and shipped her to the flesh markets. They simply forgot about the blunt instrument. And now that instrument is coming to break their galaxy apart. 5 standard minutes. That was all it took to dismantle a dynasty that had stood for 3 centuries. Gideon Reed lay on the cold, polished obsidian floor of the royal atrium, his body completely paralyzed by a synthetic neurotoxin. He couldn't move his arms. He couldn't turn his head. He could only watch as the palace guard men he had shared rations and jokes with systematically executed the royal retinue. The air smelled of ozone-burnt fabric and the sharp coppery tang of sudden death. Through the narrow corridor of his restricted vision, Gideon saw Lord Dominic. The usurper wore a pristine white uniform, his hands clasped behind his back as he stepped over the smoking remains of the king. Dominic didn't even look at the dead monarch. His attention was entirely focused on the young woman being dragged out of the grand hall by 2 heavily armored shock troopers. Princess Victoria. She didn't scream. She had inherited her father's iron spine. But as the troopers hauled her past Gideon's paralyzed form, her eyes locked onto his. There was no plea for rescue in her expression. She knew the dose of toxin in his veins was lethal to most species. Her look was an apology, a quiet, terrifying acceptance of the end. Then the heavy blast doors slammed shut, sealing her fate, and leaving Gideon to the encroaching dark. He should have died. The autopsy report later noted that an alien physiology would have suffered complete organ failure within 60 seconds of the dart piercing their neck. But humans were different. Humanity was an apex predator species, born on a high-gravity death world, built on a biological foundation of spite and redundant systems. The toxin didn't stop Gideon's heart. It just made it beat harder, flooding his system with adrenaline to burn the poison out. He woke up 14 days later in a sterilized, stark white room at the Earth Coalition Embassy. The transition from unconsciousness to waking was not gentle. It was a violent surge of awareness. Gideon ripped the IV lines from his arm, his bare feet hitting the cold tile, before his eyes had even adjusted to the harsh fluorescent lighting. His muscles screamed in protest, a chorus of phantom agonies from the nerve damage, but he forced himself upright. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Gideon turned. Standing in the doorway was Director Hayes, the Chief Intelligence Officer for the Human Embassy. Hayes was a man who looked like he ironed his clothes while he was still wearing them. Sharp, uncompromising, and deeply bureaucratic. "Where is she?" Gideon's voice was a rusted rasp. His throat felt like it had been scoured with sand. Hayes let out a slow, deliberate breath and stepped into the room, tapping a data pad. "Sit down, Gideon. You're lucky to be breathing. Your heart stopped twice on the operating table. The medics had to cycle your blood through a synthetic scrubber just to get the heavy metals out of your liver." "Where is Victoria?" Gideon repeated, taking a step forward. He was naked, save for a pair of medical trousers, his torso, a roadmap of old shrapnel scars and fresh, angry surgical incisions. "Gone," Hayes said flatly, pulling no punches. Lord Dominic seized the throne. He claimed the king was conspiring with separatist factions and executed him for treason. As for the princess, she was declared an enemy of the state. Dominic didn't want to make her a martyr, so he quietly handed her over to the Outer Rim syndicates. She was sold Gideon. Gideon stopped. The word hung in the sterile air, heavy and suffocating. Sold. The embassy. Gideon asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. What is Earth doing about it? Nothing. Hayes replied, his tone devoid of empathy. Dominic controls the primary shipping lanes in this sector. Earth Command is not going to war over a deposed alien royal. We've officially recognized Dominic's government. It's an internal political matter. Gideon stared at the intelligence officer. He looked at the crisp suit, the polished shoes, the data pad that held the geopolitical excuses for cowardice. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a tantrum. The anger that ignited in his chest wasn't a roaring fire. It was the absolute zero of deep space. It was a cold, calculating fury that settled into his marrow. I see, Gideon whispered. He walked past Hayes to the metal locker in the corner of the room. He punched in his biometric code. Inside sat his personal effects, his armored combat vest, his heavy boots, his reinforced combat knife, and his earth-forged sidearm, a massive blocky kinetic pistol that the alien guards had always mocked for being primitive. Gideon Hayes warned a hint of genuine concern, finally breaking through his bureaucratic veneer. If you walk out that door, you do it alone. The coalition will disavow you. You won't have a badge, a backing, or a safety net. You'll be a rogue agent operating in hostile territory. Gideon strapped the holster to his thigh. The familiar heavy weight of the gun against his leg grounded him. He turned to face Hayes, his eyes completely dead of any warmth. I was never a diplomat, Hayes. I was a bodyguard. Gideon grabbed his worn leather jacket. And my shift isn't over. The orbital station known as Terminus was less of a trading hub and more of a festering wound in the side of the galaxy. It hung in the shadow of a dying red dwarf star, a sprawling, chaotic mass of welded freighters, neon-lit gangways, and pressurized domes that smelled eternally of recycled oxygen, cheap synthetic liquor, and fear. Gideon walked through the crowded promenade of Sector 4, the collar of his jacket turned up against the artificial chill. The inhabitants of Terminus gave him a wide berth. Humans were a rare sight this far out, and they carried a reputation. In a galaxy that relied on plasma-shielding elegant energy weapons and computerized diplomacy, humanity was seen as a blunt, terrifying anachronism. They were physically dense, uncomfortably strong, and possessed an endurance that defied logic. Gideon wasn't here to sightsee. He was looking for a man named Balthazar. Balthazar was a broker. He dealt in everything the civilized core worlds pretended didn't exist: illegal narcotics, stolen military tech, and living flesh. If a high-profile prisoner was moved from the inner sectors to the outer rim, Balthazar handled the transit paperwork. Gideon found him in the back of a deafeningly loud cantina called the Rusty Anchor. The air was thick with the blue, acrid smoke of hookah pipes, and the bass of the synth music rattled the shot glasses on the sticky metal tables. Balthazar was holding court in a reinforced booth, flanked by 4 massive reptilian enforcers. Gideon didn't bother with stealth. Stealth was for assassins. He was sending a message. He walked straight toward the booth. The first enforcer stepped forward, a guttural warning clicking in his throat, raising a shock baton. Gideon didn't break stride. He ducked under the clumsy swing, pivoted, and drove the heel of his boot into the side of the enforcer's knee. The joint snapped with the sound of a dry branch breaking. As the reptilian guard went down, Gideon grabbed him by the tactical harness and threw his heavy bulk into the second guard, sending them both crashing through a glass table. The music violently cut out. The cantina erupted into panicked shouts as patrons scrambled for the exits. The remaining two guards drew their plasma pistols, but human reflexes were honed by millennia of terrestrial warfare. Gideon had drawn his sidearm before they even raised their barrels. Two deafening cracks echoed through the room. Kinetic slugs traveling at supersonic speeds punched straight through the aliens' personal energy shields, which were designed to disperse heat, not mass, and embedded into their shoulders. Both guards hit the floor, screaming in shock. Gideon holstered his weapon, the barrel smoking, and slid into the booth opposite Balthazar. The broker was pale, all four of his eyes wide with absolute terror. He pressed his back against the vinyl seat, his hands raised in surrender. "I don't have money," Balthazar stammered his translator collar, turning his panicked alien clicks into heavily accented English. "Take whatever you want, just don't kill me." Gideon leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He looked at Balthazar with the detached curiosity of a mechanic inspecting a broken engine. "I don't want your money, Balthazar. I want a shipping manifest. 14 days ago, Lord Dominic sold a high-value asset to the guilds. A human female wait an alien female. Royal blood, Princess Victoria." Gideon's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the groans of the wounded guards on the floor. "Where did she go?" Balthazar swallowed hard. "You're a dead man. If Dominic finds out I talked..." Gideon reached across the table, grabbed Balthazar by the throat, and slammed him face first into the metal tabletop. He pinned the broker down, drawing his combat knife and pressing the cold steel against Balthazar's primary carotid artery. "Dominic is light years away," Gideon said softly. "I am sitting right in front of you. Choose your fear wisely." The Red Iron Syndicate. Balthazar choked out, thrashing weakly. They bought her to make an example. They transferred her to a holding facility on the asteroid colony Tartarus. She was scheduled to be moved to the deep core mines yesterday. Gideon held the broker down for 3 agonizing seconds, letting the reality of the threat sink into the alien's bones. Then he let go. Balthazar gasped for air, rubbing his neck. "If you're lying to me," Gideon said, standing up and adjusting his jacket, "I'll come back, and I won't ask twice." Before leaving the station, Gideon had one more stop. He navigated the labyrinthine maintenance shafts to reach a sealed bunker. Inside was Caleb, a human expatriate and arms dealer who had long ago decided that human misery paid better than human diplomacy. Caleb's shop was a chaotic armory of heavy ordnance smelling of gun oil and cordite. "Gideon," Caleb grunted, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. "Heard you made a mess at the anchor. You're drawing a lot of heat, old friend." "I need gear, Caleb. Heavy, ugly, and loud." Caleb sighed, walking over to a reinforced locker. He punched in a code, and the heavy door slid open, revealing an arsenal of Earth-made kinetic weapons. "You're going up against the Red Iron Syndicate. They run a private army. You can't shoot your way through a fortress." "I don't plan on shooting through a fortress," Gideon said, picking up a heavy pump-action combat shotgun, testing the weight, and checking the action. The mechanical clack-clack was a sound that didn't exist anywhere else in the galaxy. "I plan on tearing it down to the foundation." He bought the shotgun 36 armor-piercing slugs, a belt of incendiary grenades, and a breaching charge that could blow a hole in a dreadnought's hull. "You're fighting a war for a dead crown, Gideon," Caleb said quietly as he handed over the duffel bag. "I'm not fighting for a crown," Gideon replied, shouldering the heavy bag. "I'm fighting for a promise." The holding facility on Tartarus was carved directly into the rock of a massive drifting asteroid. It was a brutalist piece of architecture, all jagged edges, reinforced steel, and automated gun turrets tracking every approaching vessel. It was designed to look impregnable. Gideon didn't approach in a ship. He had hijacked a hollowed-out cargo container from a passing automated freighter, drifting in the cold vacuum of space for 6 hours until orbital mechanics brought him within 100 meters of the facility's blind spot. Wearing a heavy EVA suit, he propelled himself across the void, the absolute silence of space pressing against his helmet. He locked his magnetic boots onto the outer hull of the facility's secondary airlock. He didn't try to hack the keypad. He placed the heavy breaching charge against the locking mechanism, set the timer for 10 seconds, and stepped back. The explosion didn't make a sound in the vacuum, but the vibration rattled Gideon's teeth. The heavy steel doors blew inward, a violent decompression venting atmosphere, and 2 unlucky syndicate guards out into the void. Gideon stepped through the breach, sealing his helmet, and waiting for the emergency bulkheads to slam down, restoring gravity and atmosphere to the corridor. The red emergency lights bathed the hallway in a bloody glow. Sirens blared a high-pitched alien wail that grated on the ears. Gideon unlatched his helmet, dropping it to the floor. He racked a slug into the chamber of the shotgun. The response team arrived in less than 40 seconds. 6 red iron mercenaries clad in heavy composite armor rounded the corner. They expected a rival syndicate raid, perhaps a squad of heavily armed pirates. They did not expect one very angry human. Gideon didn't take cover. He stepped directly into the center of the corridor and pulled the trigger. The roar of the shotgun was deafening in the enclosed space. The heavy kinetic slug hit the lead mercenary dead center in the chest. His energy shield flared brilliant purple for a microsecond before completely overloading the sheer physical mass of the projectile, crushing his breastplate and throwing him violently backward into his comrades. Panic rippled through the alien squad. They fired their plasma rifles, searing bolts of superheated gas, scorching the walls around Gideon. But his movement was relentless. He advanced, pumping the shotgun, firing again and again. It was a brutal mechanical rhythm. Step, rack, fire, step, rack, fire. The mercenaries broke. They were used to prolonged firefights, hiding behind cover, waiting for shields to recharge. They had no countermeasure for a walking tank that simply walked through their fire, using concussive force to shatter their lines. Gideon stepped over the groaning bodies, his face completely devoid of expression. He reached the main control terminal of the holding block and plugged in a decryption spike Caleb had provided. The heavy blast doors of the cell blocks ground open. Gideon walked down the rows of cages. The stench of unwashed bodies, despair, and sickness hit him like a physical blow. Hundreds of slaves, various species, emaciated, terrified, bearing the brutal electric burn scars of the slavers' collars, cowered in the corners of their cells. Gideon walked cell to cell, his eyes scanning every face, looking for the regal, bearing the familiar eyes of the princess. Cell block A. Nothing. Cell block B. Nothing. He reached the final cell. Inside sat a dozen humans and a smattering of alien laborers, but no Victoria. Gideon grabbed the cell bars, his knuckles turning white. He keyed his comms, tapping into the facility's internal network to find the warden. He found the administrative logs, Victoria's transfer code. She wasn't here. She had been moved 3 days ago to the Syndicate's flagship, a mobile dreadnought known as the Leviathan. A heavy silence fell over Gideon. He had missed her. He looked at the slaves in the cell. A young human girl, no older than 19, looked up at him trembling. She saw the blood on his armor, the heavy weapon in his hands, and she flinched. Gideon's hardened exterior fractured just for a fraction of a second. Humanity's darkest legacy was slavery, an old sin that they had spent centuries trying to scrub from their collective soul. Seeing it here, seeing his own kind and others treated like cargo, ignited a different kind of fire inside him. It wasn't just about Victoria anymore. Gideon reached into his tactical pouch and pulled out the master control key he had ripped from the dead guard commander. He tossed it through the bars. It clattered at the feet of an older, scarred alien who looked like a former soldier. "Take this," Gideon ordered, his voice echoing in the damp block. "Unlock the collars. You'll find 36 dead mercenaries in the East Corridor. Take their weapons. The docking bay is 4 levels up. Take a ship and scatter." The old alien picked up the key, his hand shaking. Who are you? Why are you doing this?" "I'm just a guy who hates bullies," Gideon said softly. He turned away, walking back toward the administrative command center. He wasn't leaving quietly. He dragged a surviving syndicate officer, a sniveling administrator named Simon, out from beneath a console. "Open a channel to the Leviathan," Gideon ordered, pressing the barrel of his sidearm against Simon's temple. Simon, weeping and terrified, frantically typed on the console. A holographic projection flared to life, showing the sneering, heavily scarred face of a syndicate warlord. "What is the meaning of this?" the warlord demanded, his voice thick with authority. "Why is Tartarus facility offline?" Gideon grabbed Simon by the collar and threw him out of the holocam's view, stepping into the blue light himself. He stared directly into the warlord's eyes. "You bought a girl from Lord Dominic," Gideon said, his voice flat, carrying the terrifying calm of a brewing hurricane. "Princess Victoria." The warlord paused, realizing he was looking at a human. He let out a harsh, barking laugh. "And what if I did? What is Earth going to do?" "Send a sternly worded diplomatic protest. Earth isn't coming for you," Gideon said, reaching down and entering the override codes for the facility's main reactor core. The console flashed red. Warning: containment failure imminent. Gideon looked back at the hologram. "I am." He drew his sidearm and shot the console, severing the connection. The alarms changed, pitch signaling a catastrophic meltdown. Gideon turned his back on the sparking ruins of the command center, walking calmly toward the docking bay as the facility began to tear itself apart around him. The galaxy had forgotten what humans were capable of. It was time for a reminder. The shockwave from the Tartarus facility's reactor breach caught Gideon's stolen interceptor at the edge of the asteroid field. The small ship violently pitched sideways metal, groaning under the sudden immense strain of the expanding plasma wave. Gideon didn't flinch. He gripped the control yoke, his knuckles white against the worn leather, and manually fired the starboard thrusters to correct the spin. The proximity alarm shrieked, bathing the cramped cockpit in a frantic, strobing amber light. He silenced them with a heavy, flat-palmed strike against the console. Silence returned to the cabin, save for the dull hum of the sublight engines. Gideon engaged the autopilot and leaned back in the pilot's chair. He unzipped his armored vest, wincing as the thick composite material peeled away from his undershirt. His left side was a mosaic of deep purple, bruising the result of a near miss from a concussive rifle. He reached into a crude medical kit mounted on the bulkhead, withdrew a pre-filled syringe of coagulant and painkillers, and jammed it brutally into his thigh. He didn't have time to heal. He only had time to function. Tracking a dreadnought like the Leviathan was theoretically impossible for a single fighter. The Red Iron Syndicate's flagship operated under military-grade stealth bafflers, constantly shifting its thermal signature to blend with the background radiation of deep space. But Gideon wasn't looking for a ship. He was looking for a supply chain. A vessel that size, carrying thousands of mercenaries and slaves, consumed a staggering amount of resources: water, rations, ammunition, fuel. Gideon punched a set of coordinates into the nav computer. He was heading to the rusted, hollowed-out mining colony of Oasis, a well-known refueling point for the Black Fleet. He needed a ride, and he needed a pilot who asked zero questions and possessed a suicidal lack of common sense. He needed Granger. Oasis was a miserable collection of interconnected habitats, clinging to the underside of a dead comet. Gideon found Granger exactly where he expected to pass out, in the cockpit of a heavily modified, heavily dented deep space tug called the Albatross. Granger was an older human, a former Earth Coalition dropship pilot who had traded his pension for a crippling gambling addiction and a permanent residence in the Outer Rim. He woke up coughing, scrambling for a discarded half-empty bottle of synthetic bourbon as Gideon forcefully cycled the airlock and stepped inside. "We're closed," Granger rasped, wiping his mouth with the back of a greasy sleeve. He squinted at the massive, heavily armed man standing in his narrow hallway. "Read Jesus," wept Gideon. "You look like you got chewed up by a thresher." "I need you to fly Granger," Gideon said, tossing a heavy pouch of Syndicate cred chips onto the navigation console. It hit the metal with a heavy, satisfying clink. "And I need you to fly blind." Granger eyed the pouch, then looked back at Gideon's blood-spattered armor. "You blew up Tartarus. It's all over the subspace chatter. The Red Iron Syndicate put a bounty on your head so large it could buy a small moon. If they catch me with you, they won't just kill me. They'll peel me like a piece of fruit." "They won't catch us," Gideon replied, his voice dead flat. "Because we are going to find the Leviathan dock with it and tear its heart out. They won't be looking for an attack from a single tug." Granger stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. He reached out, grabbed the pouch of cred chips, and shoved it into his jacket. "You are completely insane. You know that, right? It's a flying fortress." "Just find the supply trail," Gideon ordered, moving to the co-pilot seat and strapping in. It took them 14 hours. Granger tapped into the colony's automated fuel manifests, looking for massive, anomalous helium-3 purchases routed through shell corporations. He found a heavily armored fuel barge scheduled to rendezvous with a mobile processing unit in the uncharted Kalen sector. "That's them," Granger said, his hands dancing across the control panel. He initiated the hyperskip drive. "The Albatross has a localized sensor ghosting package. I can get us within 10 kilometers of the dreadnought by riding the sensor wake of that fuel barge. But after that, you're walking. I'm not docking this bucket with a Syndicate warship." 10 kilometers is fine," Gideon said. When they dropped out of hyperskip, the visual was staggering. The Leviathan was a monstrous wedge of black iron and glowing crimson exhaust vents, dwarfing the massive fuel barge currently tethered to its port side. It bristled with automated railgun turrets and point defense cannons. It was a predator drifting in the dark. Gideon moved to the airlock, pulling on a sleek matte black EVA suit. He strapped his heavy shotgun to his back, secured his sidearm, and checked the seal on his helmet. "I'll hold position in the debris field left by the asteroid belt," Granger said over the internal comms, his voice tight with nerves. "I give you exactly 2 hours, Gideon. After that, I'm burning hard for the core worlds, and you're a ghost." "Understood," Gideon said. He stepped into the airlock. The outer doors opened. The absolute void of space swallowed him. Gideon kicked off the hull of the Albatross, using his suit's micro-thrusters to propel himself toward the massive silhouette of the dreadnought. He was a speck of dust flying into the maw of a Leviathan. He aimed for the midship engineering section, away from the heavily guarded hangar bays and VIP observation decks. He didn't use active radar. He navigated entirely by sight, watching the slow, rhythmic rotation of the dreadnought's primary sensor dishes, timing his approach to slip through the blind spots. The cold seeped through the insulated suit, a bitter chill that settled deep into his bones. He hit the outer hull of the Leviathan, hard, the impact jarring his teeth. He immediately engaged his magnetic boots, locking himself to the cold iron. He was down. He was in. The hunt had officially begun. The maintenance airlock was old, relying on a mechanical bypass rather than the biometric scanners used on the upper decks. Gideon clamped a localized signal jammer onto the external control panel, masking the sudden drop in pressure from the ship's internal monitoring systems. He pulled a heavy plasma cutter from his thigh pouch. The blue-white flame hissed in the vacuum, melting through the locking pins in absolute silence. Gideon kicked the hatch inward, stepping into a dimly lit narrow service corridor. Gravity grabbed him, heavy and sudden. He pulled off his helmet, breathing in the stale metallic air of the dreadnought. It smelled of engine grease, ozone, and unwashed bodies. He left the EVA suit in the corridor, stripping down to his combat armor. He racked a slug into his shotgun. The heavy clack-clack was loud in the confined space, a mechanical declaration of war. His objective was Sector 4, the designated holding pens for high-value merchandise. It was located directly beneath the warlord's command deck. To get there, he had to cross 3 distinct security zones. He didn't bother with the ventilation shafts. Those were rigged with thermal sensors and automated neurotoxin vents. He took the maintenance stairwells. The first encounter happened on Deck 7. Gideon pushed open a heavy bulkhead door and walked straight into a 4-man syndicate patrol. They were laughing, trading ration packs, their heavy plasma rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They froze, staring at the lone human standing in the doorway. Gideon didn't hesitate. He brought the shotgun up. The first blast caught the closest guard in the chest, the kinetic impact shattering his sternum and throwing him backward with enough force to knock the man behind him off his feet. The third guard clawed frantically for his sidearm. Gideon stepped forward, driving the steel-reinforced butt of the shotgun into the alien's jaw. Bone splintered. The last guard managed to raise his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. Gideon dropped to one knee, letting the searing bolt of plasma scorch the air where his head had just been. He drew his kinetic sidearm and fired twice. 2 heavy slugs punched through the guard's knee and thigh. The guard collapsed, screaming. Gideon stood up. The skirmish had lasted 4 seconds. He stepped over the bodies, his expression carved from stone. He didn't run. Running elevated the heart rate and led to mistakes. He walked. a steady, inevitable march deeper into the belly of the beast. By the time he reached Sector 4, his shotgun was completely dry. He let it drop to the metal deck, relying entirely on his sidearm and the heavy combat knife sheathed at his chest. The pristine corridors of the upper decks had given way to opulent, sickening luxury. The floors were lined with synthetic velvet, and the bulkheads were adorned with stolen art from a dozen conquered worlds. Two massive, heavily armored brutes stood guard outside a set of gilded blast doors. They were distinct from the standard mercenary's personal guard. Elite. Gideon holstered his empty sidearm. He drew his knife. The guards saw him and charged, drawing crackling shock batons. They expected a brawl. Gideon gave them an execution. As the first guard swung, Gideon stepped inside the arc of the weapon, grabbing the guard's wrist with his left hand. With a brutal pivot of his hips, he used the guard's own momentum to throw him off balance, driving the combat knife up under the armpit, bypassing the armor and severing the axillary artery. The second guard hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes widening at the sudden catastrophic violence. It was all the opening Gideon needed. He ripped the knife free spun and drove a heavy boot into the second guard's kneecap. As the giant fell forward, Gideon brought his elbow down precisely on the base of the skull. The corridor went dead silent. Gideon stood panting, his chest heaving. His knuckles were bruised and his armor was slick with alien blood. He wiped the blade of his knife on his pant leg, sheathed it, and stepped over the corpses. He punched the access code he had ripped from the Tartarus warden's datapad. The gilded blast doors slid open. The room beyond was a sickening mockery of a royal chamber. Soft ambient lighting illuminated silk drapes and plush seating. In the center of the room, chained to a heavy steel pedestal by a thick, humming energy collar, sat Victoria. She was dressed in a degrading, sheer white gown, a far cry from the sharp military tunics she usually favored. Her face was bruised, a dark purple swelling around her left eye, and her lip was split. But as the doors hissed open, she didn't cower. She sat perfectly straight, her chin-raised eyes fixed on the entrance with the defiant glare of a captive hawk. When she saw Gideon, the hardened mask cracked. Just for a second, her breath hitched. Gideon stepped into the room, his heavy boots sinking into the plush carpet. He looked terrible. He was covered in grime soot and blood. He looked exactly like the blunt instrument he was born to be. He stopped 2 feet from her, pulling a heavy decryption tool from his belt. "You look awful, Gideon," Victoria said, her voice raspy but steady. "Traffic was bad, Your Highness," Gideon replied, his tone devoid of inflection, though his hands moved with frantic precision as he clamped the tool onto her energy collar. "I told you once a long time ago that your stubbornness would get you killed," she said, watching him work. She could smell the ozone and cordite clinging to him. "Dominic has the entire sector locked down. The Syndicate has a fleet. You came alone." "I brought a shotgun," Gideon corrected her. "It's empty now, but it helped." The decryption tool beeped a harsh green. The heavy iron collar snapped open and fell to the floor with a dull thud. Victoria rubbed her raw, blistered neck. She stood up. She didn't hug him. She didn't weep. They weren't those kinds of people. She reached out and gripped his armored shoulder, her fingers digging into the composite plating. "Thank you," she whispered, the sheer weight of the 2 words carrying the gravity of a dying star. "Don't thank me yet," Gideon said, turning his back to the door and drawing his combat knife again. "We still have to walk out of here." Suddenly, The soft ambient lighting of the room snapped to a harsh, blinding crimson. A klaxon began to wail, vibrating through the deck plates. The ship's internal comms crackled to life, filled with a deep, booming voice that echoed with absolute authority. "Lock down Sector 4. Seal the bulkheads. The human is inside." Gideon looked at Victoria. He handed her a plasma pistol he had taken from the dead guard in the hallway. "Do you know how to use this?" Victoria checked the battery cell, flipped the safety off, and leveled the weapon at the door. Her eyes were cold burning with a newly ignited fury. "I'm a Princess Gideon, not a pacifist. Lead the way." The corridors of the Leviathan had turned into a slaughterhouse. Gideon and Victoria moved with brutal efficiency. They weren't sneaking anymore. Stealth was entirely useless with the ship on hard lockdown. They were a hammer looking for a nail. They moved toward the secondary hangar bay, the only exit point large enough to house a shuttle capable of punching through the dreadnought's exterior shields. Victoria fired over Gideon's shoulder, the sharp crack of the plasma pistol dropping a syndicate mercenary who had leaned out from a cross corridor. She moved fluidly, her sheer silk gown stained with soot and tearing at the knees entirely, ignoring the pain of her battered feet against the cold iron grates. "2 more decks down," Victoria shouted over the blare of the klaxons. "We take the service elevator. No elevators." Gideon grunted, slamming his shoulder into a heavy fire door to wedge it shut behind them. He welded the lock with a burst from a scavenged plasma torch. "Elevators are death traps. They'll cut the cables. We take the cargo ramps." They descended into the cavernous belly of the ship. The air grew thicker, heavy with the smell of promethium fuel and hot metal. The hangar bay doors loomed ahead, massive reinforced steel plates designed to withstand the vacuum of space, but they weren't unguarded. Standing in the center of the vast open hangar floor, flanked by a dozen heavily armed syndicate enforcers, was Warlord Braddock. Braddock was a terrifying specimen. He was 8 feet of heavily augmented muscle, encased in a custom suit of powered armor. In his right hand, he held a massive gravity hammer, a weapon that could crush a light tank into scrap metal. "I admit," Braddock's voice boomed across the hangar, amplified by his armor's external speakers. "I am impressed. You butchered your way through 60 of my best men. For what a deposed royal who has nothing left to pay you." Gideon didn't say a word. He stepped out from the cover of a massive cargo container, his eyes scanning the room. 12 shooters, elevated positions. Braddock in the center with a kinetic displacement shield. It was a kill box. "Get to the shuttle," Gideon whispered to Victoria, his voice barely audible. "The sleek one on the far left pad. Prep the engines." "I am not leaving you," Victoria hissed back, her grip tightening on her pistol. "You are not fighting a mechanized warlord in a ball gown," Gideon replied flatly. "Prep the ship. When I give the signal, blow the hangar's magnetic seal." Before she could argue, Gideon sprinted. He didn't run at Braddock. He ran laterally, diving behind a stack of fuel cells as a hail of plasma fire rained down from the enforcers. Sparks rained over him, the intense heat singeing his jacket. "Flush him out!" Braddock roared, pointing his massive hammer. 3 enforcers moved forward, laying down suppressing fire. Gideon waited. He listened to the heavy thud of their boots on the metal decking. 3, 2, 1. Gideon rolled out from behind the fuel cells, a scavenged thermal detonator in his hand. He didn't throw it at the men. He threw it at the ceiling above them, directly at the massive crane winch, holding a 10-ton cargo crate suspended in the air. The detonator blew. The explosion severed the thick steel cables. The crate dropped like a meteor, crushing the three enforcers instantly with a sickening metallic crunch. The hangar deck shuddered violently from the impact. "Enough of this!" Braddock bellowed. He engaged his armor's thrusters, launching his massive frame across the room. He landed 10 feet from Gideon, the deck plating buckling under his weight. He swung the gravity hammer in a wide, devastating arc. Gideon threw himself backward. The hammer smashed into the fuel cells where he had just been hiding, rupturing them, and sending a massive fireball rolling toward the ceiling. The concussive wave picked Gideon up and threw him into the side of a parked shuttle. Pain erupted in his spine. He hit the deck hard, his vision swimming. He tasted copper. Braddock laughed a deep, guttural sound. He walked slowly toward Gideon, raising the hammer high. "You fight like a rat, human, but this ship is a trap, and you are out of corners." Gideon pushed himself up onto his knees. His left arm was numb. He looked at Braddock, then looked past the massive warlord. Through the viewport of the sleek shuttle on the far pad, he saw Victoria in the pilot's seat. She had her hand hovered over the emergency console. Her eyes met his. Gideon looked back at Braddock. He smiled. It was a horrifying, blood-stained expression. "I hate traps," Gideon rasped. He tapped his comms. "Do it." Inside the shuttle, Victoria slammed her fist down on the emergency override. A deafening alarm shrieked. "Warning, hangar bay. Decompression imminent." The massive outer doors of the hangar bay instantly blew outward. The magnetic containment field dissolved. The result was apocalyptic. A localized hurricane of decompression tore through the hangar. Everything not bolted to the deck crate's tools, dead bodies, and screaming enforcers was instantly sucked out into the freezing void of deep space. Braddock yelled in shock, his heavy magnetic boots automatically locking to the deck to prevent him from being blown out. But the localized hurricane threw off his balance. He lowered his hammer to steady himself against the gale force winds. Gideon had anchored himself to the shuttle's landing gear with his safety tether the moment he hit the deck. He drew his sidearm. He didn't aim at Braddock's heavily armored chest. He aimed at the exposed, glowing cooling vents on the back of the warlord's powered armor. 3 shots. Perfect, relentless precision. The heavy kinetic slugs punched through the cooling vents, shattering the internal regulators. Braddock's armor screamed as the reactor went critical. The warlord tried to turn his face, twisting in realization, but the armor locked down, completely frozen. "Checkmate," Gideon whispered over the roar of the vacuum. He unclipped his tether and let the decompression draft pull him backward. He slammed against the boarding ramp of Victoria's shuttle. He scrambled inside, punching the bulkhead closure. The ramp sealed, cutting off the screaming wind of the void. Through the viewport, they watched as Braddock's armor finally detonated a massive silent bloom of plasma that consumed the warlord entirely. Victoria didn't hesitate. She slammed the thrusters to maximum. The sleek shuttle shot out of the hangar bay just as the emergency bulkhead slammed shut, leaving the burning, chaotic wreckage of the Leviathan far behind them. Gideon collapsed into the co-pilot seat. He stared at the navigation console, his breathing heavy and ragged. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been run through a localized gravity crusher. Victoria kept her eyes locked on the stars ahead, her hands steady on the yoke. She reached over and lightly rested her hand on his battered arm. "Where to, Gideon?" She asked, her voice quiet, but ringing with a dangerous new authority. Gideon looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the complete death of the naive girl she had been 2 weeks ago. Lord Dominic had wanted to break a princess. Instead, he had forged a queen. "We need guns, Your Highness," Gideon said, wiping a streak of blood from his jaw. "We need an army, and then we go home." The silence of the shuttle's cockpit was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the sublight engines and the sharp, wet sound of heavy thread pulling through flesh. Victoria tied off the suture with a sharp tug. Gideon didn't flinch, though his jaw muscles feathered. He sat bare-chested on the metal deck, his torso a brutal canvas of deep lacerations, purple contusions, and the angry red lines of fresh stitches. "That's the last of them," Victoria said quietly. She dropped the bloodied needle into a sanitizing tray and wiped her hands on a scrap of clean gauze. Her sheer white gown was ruined, tied off at the knees and stained with soot and the blood of the men they had killed. "You do good work," Gideon rasped, rolling his shoulder to test the tension. "Your tutors didn't teach you field medicine. My tutors taught me diplomatic theory and ancient poetry." Victoria replied, her voice entirely devoid of the warmth it once held. She walked to the small viewport staring out into the dark expanse of the Callan sector. "The poetry is useless. The diplomacy died with my father. I am adapting." Gideon picked up his heavily scarred armor plate and began strapping it back on. He didn't offer words of comfort. Comfort was a luxury for people who weren't currently being hunted by an entire galactic sector. "Where are we going?" she asked, not turning away from the glass. "Outpost Jericho." Gideon said, punching a new set of coordinates into the nav computer. "It's a decommissioned mining colony sitting in the shadow of a gas giant. It's a graveyard for old ships and older soldiers. We need an army, and Jericho is where the Earth Coalition leaves its broken toys." "Mercenaries," Victoria concluded. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Can you trust them?" "I don't trust anyone," Gideon said flatly. "But I understand them, and more importantly, they understand math. Dominic is rich, but he's arrogant. He pays in royal decrees and promises. We're going to pay in cold, hard, stolen syndicate creds." They dropped out of hyperskip 12 hours later. Outpost Jericho wasn't a station so much as a tumor growing on the side of a massive hollowed-out asteroid. It was a sprawling shantytown of welded freighter hulls, tethered solar sails, and flashing neon signs that bled through the thick clouds of venting plasma. Gideon docked the shuttle in a rusted private bay. He didn't bring his weapons out in the open. He kept his heavy coat zipped, concealing his sidearm, but his posture screamed violence. Everyone in the docking bay, smugglers, spice runners, and scarred alien drifters, gave him a wide berth. He led Victoria through the winding, damp corridors of the station until they reached a heavy blast door guarded by 2 massive automated turrets. Gideon keyed a sequence into the panel. The doors ground open, revealing a cavernous tactical command center that smelled of stale cigar smoke, synthetic coffee, and gun oil. Standing over a holographic projection table was Beckett. Beckett was an old war dog. He was missing his left eye, replaced by a crude cybernetic optic that glowed a faint, angry red. He wore faded green fatigues and a mechanical exo brace on his right leg. He commanded the Iron Hounds, a private military corporation made up almost entirely of human expatriates and alien deserters who had nowhere else to go. Beckett looked up his good eye, narrowing. I heard you blew up a red iron dreadnought, Gideon. I thought it was a rumor. You look like hell. I brought a friend, Gideon said, stepping aside to let Victoria into the room. Beckett let out a low whistle, leaning heavily on the hollow table. The dead Royale. Dominic announced your execution 3 days ago. Said you were killed resisting arrest by separatist factions. He looked Victoria up and down. You don't look dead, Your Highness, but you do look broke. Victoria didn't wait for Gideon to intercede. She stepped forward, planting her hands firmly on the edge of the hollow table, staring directly into Beckett's glowing, cybernetic eye. I am not here to hire you with my father's money, Commander, Victoria said, her voice echoing with absolute authority. I am here to offer you an investment. Beckett chuckled a dry, rasping sound. An investment in what? A suicide mission against the capital. Dominic has a planetary shield, 4 orbital defense platforms, and an army of Praetorians who don't feel pain. I have 300 angry men and a fleet of retrofitted mining barges. You have humanity, Victoria countered, her tone sharp as a razor. Dominic relies on plasma grids, laser batteries, and clean energy warfare. He thinks like an aristocrat. I want you to think like a human. I want you to break his sky. She reached into Gideon's tactical pouch, a move that surprised even Gideon, and pulled out the massive data drive they had ripped from the Leviathan's core. She slammed it onto the table. This is the master ledger of the Red Iron Syndicate. Bank accounts, hidden armories, blackmail files on half the nobles in the core worlds. It is worth billions, Victoria said. Help me take back my home. Help me kill the man who murdered my father, and I will give you the keys to the underworld. Beckett stared at the drive. Then he looked at Gideon. She's terrifying, Beckett muttered. I know, Gideon replied, a faint, dangerous smirk touching the corner of his mouth. Are the dogs hungry, Beckett? Beckett reached out, picking up the data drive. He tossed it in the air, caught it, and grinned. It was a vicious, predatory expression. Give me 48 hours, Beckett said. I'll get the barges fueled. We're going to teach the nobility a lesson in calculated physics. The capital city of Olympia was a monument to alien vanity. Built on a plateau of white marble and gleaming glass, it was surrounded by pristine gardens and towering statues of the ruling dynasty. Above the city hung the Aegis grid, a massive interlocking matrix of hard light energy shields that bathed the entire plateau in a faint, shimmering golden hue. Lord Dominic was sitting in the grand dining hall of the royal palace, holding a lavish gala to celebrate his ascension. The nobles drank sparkling Syntha wine, laughing at the rumors of a human uprising in the outer rim. They didn't hear the sirens until it was too late. In high orbit, completely ignoring traditional tactical doctrines, the Iron Hounds didn't jump in with warships. They jumped in with heavily modified industrial mining haulers. Aboard the flagship barge, Beckett stood on the bridge, staring down at the golden shimmering dot of the capital city. They're painting us with targeting lasers, a sensor operator called out. Defense platforms are spinning up their plasma batteries. Let them, Beckett growled. Drop the rocks. The Aegis grid was designed to disperse thermal energy and deflect plasma bolts. It was a masterpiece of advanced engineering. But it was built under the assumption that an enemy would fight a civilized war. The mining barges opened their massive lower cargo bays. They weren't dropping bombs. They were dropping solid 100-ton rods of refined tungsten, accelerated to terminal velocity by gravity and magnetic rails. The kinetic bombardment hit the Aegis grid like the hammer of a vengeful god. Inside the palace, the crystal chandeliers shattered simultaneously. The golden shield above the city flashed blinding white as it tried to absorb the impossible kinetic mass of the tungsten rods. It held for exactly 4 seconds. Then the localized shield generators scattered around the city simply exploded, unable to vent the astronomical amount of displaced energy. The sky tore open. The golden dome shattered into a billion dissipating fragments of hard light. "Shield is down," the operator yelled. "Deploy the drop pods," Beckett ordered. "Show them how Earth makes war." From the bellies of the mining barges, hundreds of black, unshielded drop pods shot out, burning through the atmosphere like a swarm of angry hornets. They didn't have retro rockets designed for a soft landing. They used aggressive kinetic dampeners, slamming into the pristine courtyards, marble plazas, and manicured gardens of the palace with the force of artillery shells. Gideon was in the vanguard. His pod hit the grand courtyard of the palace, cratering the white marble and kicking up a massive cloud of dust and debris. The explosive bolts on the pod door blew, and Gideon stepped out into the chaos. He had traded his shotgun for a heavy earth-forged assault rifle loaded with armor-piercing depleted uranium rounds. Around him, the iron hounds poured out of their pods, screaming battle cries, their heavy boots crushing the delicate alien flora. The Royal Praetorians' Dominic's elite guard surged out of the palace doors. They wore gleaming silver armor and carried elegant sweeping energy halberds and precision beam rifles. It was an absolute slaughter. The Praetorians tried to form defensive lines, waiting for their targeting computers to lock on. Gideon didn't wait. He moved like a machine, his assault rifle barking in short, controlled bursts. The kinetic rounds didn't just penetrate the silver armor. They shattered it, turning the elegant defense plates into lethal shrapnel. Step, fire, pivot, fire. Gideon advanced through the courtyard, a walking epicenter of violence. Beside him, Victoria moved with lethal grace, wielding a scavenged submachine gun. She didn't flinch as the blood of her former guard splashed across the marble. She was a ghost of vengeance, her eyes locked on the massive shattered golden doors of the grand hall. A Praetorian swung an energy halberd at her head. Gideon stepped in, taking the glancing blow on his reinforced shoulder pauldron. The composite armor cracked, but he ignored the searing pain. He drove the butt of his rifle into the guard's visor, shattering the glass, then drew his combat knife and drove it through the weak point in the neck seal. "Keep moving!" Gideon roared over the deafening cacophony of gunfire and screaming. "They don't know how to fight a ground war. Push the line." The iron hounds surged forward, a tidal wave of grit and concussive force. They breached the grand doors, spilling into the opulent hallways of the palace. The pristine white walls were quickly painted with soot scorch marks and the grim reality of a species that had perfected the art of killing millennia ago. Gideon led the charge up the grand staircase. He didn't bother checking corners. He simply fired through the walls, the heavy uranium rounds, punching through the expensive synthetic drywall and dropping the guards hiding on the other side. They reached the heavy obsidian blast doors of the royal atrium. The doors were sealed tight. "Breach it," Victoria ordered, not even out of breath. Gideon pulled 2 blocks of high-explosive plastic from his webbing, molded them against the locking mechanisms, and stepped back, pulling Victoria behind the cover of a massive marble pillar. "Fire in the hole!" Gideon muttered, hitting the detonator. The explosion blew the heavy obsidian doors entirely off their hinges, sending them crashing into the atrium beyond. Gideon racked a fresh magazine into his rifle. He looked down at Victoria. Her face was smudged with dirt and gunpowder, her eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fire. "After you, Your Highness," Gideon said. Victoria stepped through the smoke into the room where her life had ended a month ago. It was time for a resurrection. The royal atrium was a masterpiece of architectural dominance designed to make anyone who entered feel small. A massive vaulted glass ceiling looked out onto the burning sky above. At the far end of the room sat the sovereign chair, a towering construction of polished obsidian and gold. Standing in front of it was Lord Dominic. He wasn't running. He was surrounded by his last line of defense, 6 elite blood guard towering aliens encased in heavy-powered siege armor, wielding rotary plasma cannons. Dominic himself wore a pristine white uniform entirely out of place in the soot-stained reality of the invasion. Around his waist was a heavy metallic belt projecting a localized military-grade distortion field. "Fascinating!" Dominic sneered, his voice amplified across the massive room. He looked at the bodies of his soldiers strewn in the hallway. "You actually brought the savage dogs to my door, Victoria. I suppose I should applaud your descent into barbarism." "I didn't bring dogs, Dominic," Victoria said, stepping into the center of the room. She lowered her submachine gun, her eyes locking onto the usurper. "I brought a reckoning." "Kill them," Dominic snapped to his blood guard. The 6 giants leveled their rotary cannons. Gideon didn't shoot at them. He shot the massive load-bearing glass fixtures on the vaulted ceiling directly above their heads. The heavy uranium rounds shattered the structural supports. Tons of reinforced glass and heavy steel framing rained down on the blood guard, crushing 3 of them instantly and throwing the others off balance. Before the dust could even settle, Gideon sprinted. He didn't run in a straight line. He moved with a jagged, unpredictable geometry sliding across the polished floor as a hail of plasma fire tracked his movement, scorching the marble where he had been a fraction of a second before. He reached the first surviving guard. The alien tried to bring his massive cannon to bear. Gideon grabbed the barrel, pointing it upward, just as it fired, sending a stream of superheated plasma into the ceiling. With his other hand, Gideon drove his combat knife straight up through the heavy articulation joint beneath the guard's chin. The guard collapsed. The second guard swung a heavy armored fist. The blow caught Gideon in the ribs. He felt 2 bones snap the sheer kinetic force, throwing him backward into a marble pillar. He slumped to the floor, gasping for air. The guard lumbered forward to finish him. A sharp staccato burst of gunfire echoed through the atrium. Victoria walked forward, her weapon raised, burying half a magazine of armor-piercing rounds into the back of the guard's knee joint. The massive alien roared in pain, dropping to one knee. Gideon pushed himself off the floor, ignoring the blinding agony in his chest. He lunged forward, grabbed the guard's own plasma cannon, and brutally twisted it backward, firing it directly into the alien's chest plate. Silence fell over the room, save for the crackle of distant fires and the heavy, ragged breathing of the human bodyguard. Gideon dropped the cannon. He looked at Dominic. The usurper took a step back, finally realizing the reality of his situation. He tapped the belt at his waist. The distortion field flared to life, a localized bubble of absolute kinetic denial. "You can't touch me, human!" Dominic spat, though his voice trembled. "This field is rated for orbital debris. A bullet will bounce off. A blade will snap. Gideon stared at the shimmering barrier. He didn't raise his rifle. He dropped it. The heavy weapon clattered on the marble. He sheathed his knife. "I don't need a blade," Gideon said softly. He walked slowly up the steps of the dais. Dominic watched him, a smug, terrified smile on his face. Gideon reached the barrier. He didn't punch it. He didn't try to strike it. Humanity evolved on a high-gravity death world. Their muscles were denser, their skeletal structure built to withstand crushing pressure. Gideon placed his hands against the shimmering, hard-light barrier. "What are you doing?" Dominic asked, his smile faltering. "It's impenetrable." Gideon locked his jaw. The veins in his neck bulged. He pushed. The shield didn't break, but the mechanical generator projecting it wasn't built to withstand sustained crushing, sheer physical force applied over a wide surface area. The shield pushed back against Dominic's belt. Gideon kept pushing, driving all of his mass, all of his density, and all of his cold, calculated fury into the barrier. The metal belt around Dominic's waist began to groan. "Stop!" Dominic yelled, stumbling backward. But Gideon stepped forward, pinning the usurper against the base of the sovereign chair. He pushed harder. The whine of the shield generator reached a deafening pitch. Sparks flew from the belt as the internal regulators overloaded, unable to compensate for the relentless, crushing physical pressure of an apex predator. With a loud, cracking pop, the generator exploded in a shower of sparks. The shield collapsed. Gideon grabbed Dominic by the throat of his pristine white uniform and threw him violently to the floor at Victoria's feet. Dominic scrambled backward, his arrogance completely shattered. He looked up at Victoria, holding his hands up in a desperate plea. "Victoria, please," Dominic begged, his voice cracking. "I can give you the treasury. I can order the fleets to stand down. We can negotiate a transition of power. You are a civilized royal. You don't execute prisoners." Victoria stood over him. She looked at the man who had ordered her father murdered. She looked at the man who had sold her into the dark. She ejected the spent magazine from her weapon and slammed a fresh one home. The mechanical clack echoed loudly in the vast room. "The princess you knew died in the flesh markets," Victoria said, her voice colder than the vacuum of space. "I am something entirely different." She raised the weapon and fired a single round. Dominic collapsed lifeless on the marble floor. The atrium was dead quiet. The war outside was winding down the capital's defenses, broken, the remaining Praetorians surrendering to the Iron Hounds. Victoria slowly lowered the gun. She stood there for a long time, staring at the body, processing the staggering weight of what she had just done and what she had become. The galaxy would never look at her family the same way again. They wouldn't see diplomats. They would see conquerors. Gideon stood nearby, holding his fractured ribs. He watched her. Victoria turned, her ruined white gown shifting around her. She walked past the body up the obsidian steps and sat down on the sovereign chair. The gold and black stone framed her perfectly. She looked out over the ruined hall, her posture regal, hardened, and absolutely terrifying. Gideon walked up the steps. He didn't stand beside her. He didn't take a seat of honor. He moved to the shadows directly behind the chair. He crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes scanning the empty room, forever vigilant. "The sector will retaliate," Victoria said, quietly, looking straight ahead. "The guilds, the core worlds, they will come for us." "Let them come," Gideon replied, his voice a low, gravelly promise in the dark. My shift isn't over. If this gritty, high-stakes tale of vengeance and human resilience kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi stories. Gideon and Victoria have taken back the crown, but a galaxy-wide war is just beginning. What do you think the core worlds will do next? Will humanity officially step in, or will the new queen face the armada alone? Drop your theories in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans and stay tuned for our next galactic adventure.